Did you know that during World War II, American tanks were poured with concrete in the armor? World War II was a very intense conflict where rapid technological advancement caused the obsolescence of military equipment. Day by day, new weapons emerged that made other weapons obsolete. In the case of tanks, the Germans had a myriad of countermeasures to face the Allied armored vehicles. In the middle and final stages of the conflict, these armored vehicles were extremely vulnerable to the sophisticated weapons of the German army. Weapons such as magnetic mines and the later Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck made it possible for any infantry soldier to destroy an Allied tank without prior notice. For this reason, the crews of the M4 Sherman tanks, in a very creative way, tried to improve the protection of their tanks with whatever they had at their disposal in order to give an extra layer of protection to their tanks and thus be able to avoid the German anti-tank weapons. One of the many strategies the Americans used was to pour concrete over their tanks. The concrete was mostly poured on the front of the armor, where it was most common to receive projectiles, although sometimes it was poured on the sides of the tank as well. It sounds a bit silly, but it was something that was seen on some 1004 Sherman tanks. But if we stop to think, it wasn't such a far-fetched idea either. After all, throughout the 20th century, bunkers were made with concrete, and these were extremely safe. The problem with this was that concrete itself is easy to penetrate by projectiles. What really gives it great strength and resistance are the plates or steel rods that are usually added to it when it is raw, in addition to the fact that the thickness of the concrete plates on the tanks was insufficient to make a noticeable difference when receiving a tank shot. However, it was useful for one thing, preventing the high-explosive anti-tank projectiles launched by German anti-tank grenade launchers and rocket launchers from penetrating the tank's armor due to having too much separation between the high-explosive anti-tank charge and the armor, although obviously it was only useful if the high-explosive anti-tank charge impacted in areas with concrete. Also, the concrete prevented anti-tank mines from sticking to the armor. But all this brought a great disadvantage, and it was that, of course, concrete weighs quite a bit, and obviously made the tank slower, and also all this weight caused greater wear on the suspension and on the engine. In my opinion, the concrete was definitely counterproductive in tanks, but maybe psychologically for the crews it was beneficial, since it made them feel more protected. The Americans not only used concrete in the armor for defensive purposes. An interesting feature found in American tanks from World War II is that they carried spare tracks hanging on the front of the tank. They also did this to provide greater protection to the tank, and it was much more common to see this. That 1004 Shermans with concrete, and more than anything you're going to see it in Canadian and British tanks. They were the ones who created these practices. The tracks of the 1004 Shermans were quite thick, and they were made of steel. Unlike concrete, these tracks did provide extra protection on the tank. Not too remarkable, but it was protection. After all, they were hung in places where the armor had weaknesses, and not only did they hang the spare tracks of their own tanks, but it was common to see 1004 Shermans with tracks from other tanks welded onto the armor, even tracks from Allied or German tanks that had been destroyed previously. Another improvised measure to protect the tanks were sandbags. These have been used since forever to stop bullets. In 1944, this practice proliferated among the Allies, and it was very common to see tanks with sandbags on the sides and more commonly on the front of the tank. Even the crews welded steel frames to mount these sandbags more comfortably and so they wouldn't fall off easily. And although obviously a tank projectile could penetrate this defense in a very simple way, the effectiveness of the German infantry's anti-tank measures were greatly reduced because the sandbags provided protection against high-explosive anti-tank projectiles, making them explode at a distance too far from the armor to be effective, although obviously the extra weight of the sand caused extra damage to the suspension and also made the tank, of course, slower. A final example of the cunning of the Allied tank crews. On the Western Front was the reused armor. Often, when crews had enough equipment and time, you could see American tanks with armor plates from destroyed Allied or enemy tanks in order to provide greater resistance to the tank. Unlike all the methods we have seen previously, this practice did provide a considerable increase in the tank's protection, sometimes giving it double the protection by having double armor plate. This was very rare to see because the crews never had access to the equipment and much less the time to do these things, but there were many cases of 1004 Sherman tanks with extra armor, as we would see on the German Stug 3 armored vehicles, although on the Stug 3 it was something standardized and factory-made. Finally, 1004 Sherman tanks also used to carry logs on the sides, but we already talked about that in a previous video, so one highly recommend you watch it. The link is in the description. All these protections could be beneficial or not, but they are examples of how ingenious we can be in times of pressure, and in any case, they made the crews of their tanks feel much safer.